The day Mamie Fletcher realized she had fallen in love with a man she had never met was the same day his name arrived on a telegram telling her he was still alive. She stood in the doorway of the land office in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1883, holding that yellow slip of paper against her chest, while the wind came down off the prairie and pulled at the loose strands of her dark hair. The telegram was from a military courier out of Fort Dodge, relayed through 3 different telegraph stations, and it said simply that Calvin Hudson, cattle rancher, formerly of Hudson Creek Flats, was alive and returning home. It gave no date. It gave no other detail. It simply confirmed what 4 years of silence had refused to confirm, and what the county clerk, old Silas Denny, had declared legally ambiguous for the better part of 2 years. Mamie read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the leather satchel she carried everywhere, the same satchel that held 4 years of ledgers, tax documents, water rights filings, grazing permits, and boundary surveys that she had painstakingly maintained on behalf of a man she had never once laid eyes on. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow for 5 years. Her own husband, Thomas Fletcher, had died of a fever in the spring of 1878, leaving her a small house on the edge of Caldwell, $200 in savings that evaporated within 18 months, and a particular talent for numbers and record-keeping that had kept her fed ever since. She had no children. She had no family within 400 miles. What she had was a precise and methodical mind, ink-stained fingers, and a reputation in Caldwell as the woman who could untangle any title dispute, clarify any deed, and make sense of any grazing boundary that 2 ranchers decided to disagree about over whiskey and wounded pride. It had been old Silas Denny himself who had brought Calvin Hudson's land records to her desk in the spring of 1879. He had set down a stack of papers nearly 6 inches thick, dropped into the chair across from her, and said, "Mamie, I got a situation." The situation was this. Calvin Hudson had ridden out with a cattle drive headed southwest in October of 1878, meaning to sell a herd in New Mexico territory and return by Christmas. He had never returned. His ranch foreman, a reliable man named Gus Torrance, had stayed on through the winter and then written a letter to the county clerk in February of 1879, saying that he believed Calvin Hudson to be dead and that he was leaving to find work elsewhere. After that, the ranch sat empty. The cattle were scattered. The land records sat in the county office gathering dust. The problem was that Calvin Hudson had not filed a will, had no known next of kin within the county, and had 2 neighboring ranchers already making noise about absorbing his acreage into their own holdings. One of them, a man named Prescott Hale, had already sent a lawyer from Wichita to file a claim of adverse possession on the northern quarter of Hudson's land, arguing that the land had been abandoned. The other neighbor, a weathered cattleman named Roy Dupree, was simply pushing his fence line eastward each spring, quietly, the way a man will do when he thinks nobody is watching. Mamie had taken one look at the records, seen immediately that Calvin Hudson's original deed was properly filed and legally sound, and told Silas Denny that she would take the work. What followed was 4 years of the most complicated, absorbing, and quietly consuming work of her life. She had begun by riding out to Hudson Creek Flats herself, which was not something a woman in 1879 Kansas did alone without a good reason and a reliable horse. She had both. She rode a steady roan mare named Clover who had belonged to Thomas and who had outlasted him with cheerful, uncomplicated loyalty. Mamie had looked at the land and understood at once why a man would fight to keep it. The creek ran clear and cold through a broad valley sheltered on 3 sides by low limestone bluffs. The grass was tall and rich. There were mature cottonwood trees along the water that would have taken 50 years to reach that height. Someone had built a solid house of limestone block, small but well-made, with a stone barn attached by a covered passage. Whoever Calvin Hudson was, he had built with the intention of staying. She had filed an immediate injunction against Prescott Hale's adverse possession claim, arguing correctly that the legal waiting period had not elapsed, and that the absence of a death certificate meant the land could not be classified as abandoned under Kansas statutes. The judge in Caldwell, a thin, unhappy man named Beckworth, had agreed with her reluctantly, because he was also friends with Hale's Wichita lawyer. She had documented Roy Dupree's fence incursions with surveyor's measurements and filed those documents with the county registrar. Dupree had quietly moved his fence back, and then she had simply continued. Each spring she filed the necessary grazing permits. Each year she paid the property taxes out of the county's holding account for disputed estates, carefully documenting every expenditure. When a hard winter in 1881 brought down part of the stone barn's roof, she had hired a local mason named Ike Bauer to repair it and filed the invoice against the estate account. When the creek shifted slightly after a summer flood in 1882 and threatened to alter the eastern boundary markers, she had hired the surveyor again and filed the corrected coordinates before any neighbor could claim the changed water line gave them new ground. She did all of this with perfect professional detachment. She told herself, and she told Silas Denny, that it was simply a matter of principle. A man's land was his land, and the law said so, and it was her job to keep the law honest. She told herself that every time she rode out to the Hudson place to check on the buildings, to make sure no drifters had broken in, to walk the fence lines in early spring. She told herself that when she stood in the doorway of the limestone house and looked at the small bookshelf still holding 3 volumes, a Bible, a surveying manual, and a battered copy of Don Quixote, and felt something she could not quite name pull at her chest. She told herself that every time she looked at his signature on the original deed, Calvin Hudson, written in a strong, deliberate hand that slanted slightly to the right, and thought about what kind of man wrote his name like that. So when the telegram came in October of 1883 saying he was alive and returning, Mamie felt something shift inside her that she had been carefully not examining for 4 years. She stood in the wind outside the land office and admitted to herself, quietly and without drama, that she had been keeping his land safe the way a person keeps something safe when they are not entirely certain it does not already belong to their heart. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, and went back inside to make sure every single record was in perfect order before he arrived. She spent 3 days doing nothing else. She copied every document into a fresh ledger, organized chronologically, and then cross-referenced by category. She wrote a clean summary of every legal action taken on behalf of the estate since 1879, with outcomes noted and corresponding paperwork cited. She calculated the total expenditures drawn from the estate account and compared them against the assessed value of the property improvements she had secured or maintained. She wrote it all up in her clearest hand, which was already very clear, and then she wrote it again because the first copy had a smudge on page 7 that bothered her. Silas Denny watched all of this with an expression that was part admiration and part amusement. "He's going to be overwhelmed," Silas said on the 3rd day, watching her bind the ledger. "He's going to understand exactly what happened to his land while he was gone," Mamie said. "That is what matters." "Mamie," Silas said, and there was something gentle in his old voice, "you know you could have kept his records in your head and been just as accurate." "I know," she said, and did not look up from the binding. Nobody in Caldwell knew exactly when Calvin Hudson would arrive. The telegram had said he was coming from somewhere in New Mexico territory, which could mean a journey of 2 weeks or 2 months depending on the route and the weather, and whether he was traveling alone or with others. Mamie did not know what had kept him away for 4 years. She had theories. New Mexico territory in the late 1870s and early 1880s was a dangerous place, full of range wars and outlaw trouble and disputed land claims that made Kansas look peaceable. She had read about the Lincoln County War in the newspapers and about the general lawlessness along the southern cattle trails. Whatever had happened to Calvin Hudson out there, he had survived it and he was coming home. She kept working. She had other clients, other records to maintain. A sheep farmer named Aldous Breen was in a boundary dispute with his neighbor. A widow named Clara Potts needed help filing a homestead claim. Two brothers named Delaney were trying to divide their inherited land without killing each other, which required considerable documentation and even more diplomacy. Mamie handled all of it with her usual efficient competence, and she tried not to count the days. She failed at that last part. He arrived on a Tuesday in late November, which was cold and gray and smelled of coming snow. Mamie was at her desk in the land office, which she now essentially ran on Silas Denny's behalf, since Silas's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could read large print on a good day and almost nothing on a bad one. She heard the door open and felt the gust of cold air and looked up, expecting one of her regular clients. The man standing in the doorway was not one of her regular clients. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that was longer than was fashionable and a week's worth of beard that had not decided whether it was stubble or a start. He wore a brown canvas duster that had seen serious use, trail-worn boots, and the kind of hat that had been shaped by weather rather than intention. He had dark eyes that moved quickly around the room with the practiced wariness of a man who had spent time in places where situational awareness was the difference between living and not. There was a scar along his jaw, pale against his tanned skin, that had not been there when he filed his original deed in 1875 based on the clean-faced photograph the county had taken for its land records. She knew the photograph. She had looked at it more times than she cared to admit. He was thinner than the photograph, harder in the face. But the eyes were the same dark, direct eyes, and the set of his jaw was the same. And Mamie Fletcher, who had maintained perfect composure through 4 years of legal battles and fence disputes and courthouse arguments, felt her heart do something completely undignified. "This the county land office?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, with a slight roughness to it like a man who had been doing more thinking than talking for a considerable length of time. "It is," Mamie said. "I'm looking for the clerk, fellow named Denny. Mr. Denny stepped out about an hour ago. I'm handling the office today." She paused. "Are you Calvin Hudson?" He went still for a moment in the way that a man does when his own name surprises him in a stranger's mouth. "I am. How'd you know that?" "I've been managing your land records for 4 years," she said. "I recognized you from the county photograph." He looked at her with those dark eyes for a moment that stretched slightly longer than was comfortable. "Who are you?" Mamie set down her pen. She folded her hands on the desk. She looked at this man who had occupied a significant corner of her professional life and a rather larger corner of her private thoughts for 4 years, and she said the first thing that came to her mouth, which was not what her heart would have said if given the chance to speak first. "Nobody important," she said. "Just the woman who kept your land from being taken." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that has weight to it. Calvin Hudson looked at her, and something moved in his expression, something that was trying to figure out the geometry of what he had just heard. Then he stepped fully into the office and let the door close behind him, and he said, "I'd like to hear about that if you have the time." "I have the time," Mamie said, and pulled open her desk drawer to retrieve the bound ledger she had spent 3 days preparing. She told him everything. She laid the ledger open on the desk between them and walked him through it page by page, explaining each entry, each legal action, each filing. She explained the Prescott Hale injunction and the Roy Dupree fence situation. She explained the barn roof repair, producing the invoice and the receipt. She explained the water rights filing she had done in 1882 when the state of Kansas had passed new regulations requiring all existing water claims to be formally registered within 12 months. She had filed his claim on time. She had the confirmation. He sat across from her and listened with total attention. He did not interrupt. He read along with her when she pointed at the pages. Occasionally he asked a precise question, The kind of question a man asks when he actually understands what he is reading, and she answered each one directly. After about an hour, when she reached the current summary of the estate account, he sat back in his chair and rubbed a hand over his jaw. "The barn roof," he said. "The winter of '81 was unusually harsh. The east wall took snow load damage. I know that barn," he said quietly. "Built it with my own hands in '76. Ike Bauer did a sound repair. I can give you his name if you want to speak with him about the work." "How much is in the estate account?" she told him. He nodded slowly. The account had not grown rich, but it had survived, which under the circumstances was its own kind of miracle. "Why?" he said then. "I beg your pardon. Why did you do this? You said nobody important, but this isn't nothing important work. This is 4 years of careful legal work." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" Mamie met his gaze. She thought about all the answers she could give, the professional ones, the practical ones, the ones about principles and property law. She gave him the true one. "Because it was your land," she said simply, "and someone was going to take it if nobody stopped them." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a business conversation. Then he said, "I owe you considerably more than I can probably pay right now." "You owe me the standard county rate for land record services," she said, "which Sila's Denny can bill you for. That's all." "That's not all," he said quietly. She chose not to respond to that and busied herself closing the ledger. "You'll want to ride out to Hudson Creek Flats and inspect the property. The house has been secured but not lived in. I've checked on it regularly, but it will need proper airing out and some work before winter fully sets in." "I'll ride out tomorrow." He paused. "Would you come?" She looked up from the ledger. "Why?" "Because you know that land better than I do right now," he said. There was nothing improper in his voice or his expression. It was a direct, practical statement. It was also, Mamie thought, exactly the kind of statement a man makes when he is looking for a reason to spend more time with someone, and has the good sense to find a legitimate one. "I can ride out the day after tomorrow," she said. "I have a filing I need to complete tomorrow." "Day after tomorrow," he said and stood. He was taller standing than he had seemed sitting, and she was aware of it in a way she found inconvenient. He picked up his hat from the desk where he had set it without being asked, which told her something about his manners. "What's your name, Mrs.?" she said. "Mrs. Fletcher, Mamie Fletcher." Something moved in his expression. Not disappointment exactly, but a recalibration. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "your husband runs a ranch nearby." "My husband passed 5 years ago," she said. "Fever." Another recalibration, quiet and visible. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, settled his hat, and went to the door. He paused there with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. The gray November light came through the window and fell across the desk, across the carefully bound ledger between them, and Mamie Fletcher sat very still and did not look away. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "for keeping it straight." "That's what I do," she said. He went out. The cold air rushed in briefly, and then the door closed and the office was warm again and quiet. Mamie sat for a long moment, and then she opened the ledger again and pretended to review a page she had already memorized. From the window she watched Calvin Hudson cross the main street of Caldwell with that long, unhurried stride, and she thought about how 4 years of knowing a man through his paperwork did not prepare you adequately for the reality of him in a room. He took a room at the Caldwell Hotel, which was a reasonable establishment on the north end of the main street. Mamie learned this from Pearl Hutchins, who ran the dry goods store 2 doors down from the land office, and who made it her business to know where every new arrival in town was staying. For reasons she never fully explained, but which Mamie suspected, involved an acute and lifelong interest in other people's business. "He bought supplies this morning," Pearl reported, appearing at Mamie's desk the following day before Mamie had finished her first cup of coffee. "Flour, coffee, salt pork, nails, a new hinge, 2 pounds of lard. Practical man. Asked about the livery stable. Asked about the nearest blacksmith. Didn't ask about a saloon, which I consider a mark in his favor." "I'm sure he can find a saloon on his own if he wants one," Mamie said. "He asked about you," Pearl said, with the particular tone of someone arriving at the actual point of a conversation. Mamie put down her coffee. What did he ask? He asked if Mamie Fletcher was well regarded in town. I told him she was the most reliable woman in Caldwell and possibly in all of southern Kansas, and that anyone who said different was either a fool or had lost a land dispute to her. Pearl paused. I may have said that last part slightly more colorfully. What did he say to that? He said he believed it. And then he smiled, which I will say was a very fine smile for a man who's been wherever he's been for 4 years. Mamie picked up her coffee again. Thank you, Pearl. You're riding out to the Hudson place with him tomorrow, Pearl said. It was not a question. I'm inspecting the property, Mamie said, professionally. Of course you are, Pearl said agreeably, and went back to her store. The morning of the ride out to Hudson Creek Flats was cold and clear, the kind of November day that felt like a held breath before winter fully exhaled. The prairie was tawny and wide under a pale blue sky, and the wind had settled overnight, so there was a stillness to the morning that made sound carry far. Mamie heard Calvin Hudson's horse before she saw him, coming around the corner of the land office at precisely the time they had agreed, which she noted with approval. He was riding a solid bay gelding that he had apparently purchased from the livery, and he sat a horse the way a man sits when he has spent most of his life doing it, easy and balanced, as though the horse were simply an extension of his own movement. He had shaved, she noticed. The week's beard was gone. The scar along his jaw was more visible for it, a clean white crescent against his tanned skin, and the effect was something she did not examine too closely. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "Good morning," she said, and mounted Clover with the practiced ease of her own years in the saddle. They rode out of Caldwell in comfortable silence, which was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected a man 4 years returned from the world to have a great deal to say. Instead, he rode beside her and looked at the country and seemed to be in the process of reacquainting himself with it, which she understood. There were ways the Kansas prairie looked that were unlike any other landscape, and after time away, the reacquaintance required attention. It was a ride of about 12 miles to Hudson Creek Flats, and somewhere around the 4th mile he began to talk. He told her, in a level, unadorned way that she liked, what had happened to him in New Mexico Territory. He had driven his cattle herd to Lincoln County in the late fall of 1878, and arrived in the middle of what was already becoming a serious range war between competing cattle operations backed by competing political factions. He had sold his cattle, but found himself unable to leave, partly because the roads were watched, and partly because he had witnessed things that made him a potential inconvenience to dangerous men. He had spent a year and a half working a small ranch near the town of Lincoln under an assumed name, waiting for the situation to settle. When it settled, after considerable violence that he described in brief, careful terms, he found himself in debt for wages he was owed, but that the now-dead employer could not pay. He had spent another year working cattle in the Texas Panhandle, earning enough to stake himself back onto solid footing. By the time he was ready to come home, he had stopped at a land office in Tascosa and tried to inquire about his Kansas holdings, and received enough confusing and contradictory information about the legal status of unoccupied property in Kansas that he had been afraid to come back. "I thought it might already be gone," he said. They were riding along the first of the limestone bluffs now, and Mamie could see the cottonwoods along the creek in the middle distance, bare-limbed and silver in the winter light. "I thought Hale might have taken it." "He tried," Mamie said. "How did you stop him?" "I read the statutes more carefully than his lawyer did," she said, "and I filed first." He looked at her sidelong with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. That's simple," she said. "Most legal maneuvering is just a matter of who does the work earliest and most accurately. His lawyer was counting on the land being truly abandoned and the records being in disorder." "The records were not in disorder." "No," he said. "They certainly were not." They arrived at the property and rode through the open gate, which Mamie had kept oiled so it swung freely. The limestone house sat in the shelter of the bluffs, solid and square, its walls golden gray in the midday light. The barn was attached by the covered passage, the repaired east wall matching the original stonework well enough that you had to look closely to see the seam. The cottonwoods along the creek stood in a line, their bare branches making a fine dark tracery against the sky, and the creek itself ran clear over its limestone bed, with a sound that was very clean and very quiet. Calvin Hudson stopped his horse and simply looked at it for a long moment. Mamie stopped beside him and let him have the moment without filling it. When he finally dismounted, he did it slowly, and he stood with one hand on his horse's neck and looked at the house and the barn and the land that spread out around them, and she saw something move across his face that was too large for an ordinary expression. It was the look of a man who has been afraid of a loss for so long that the discovery of its absence does not yet feel entirely real. "It's exactly as I left it," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "The door latch on the barn is new," she said. "The original broke in '81. And the east wall repair, of course. But otherwise it's as you left it, yes." He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face then that she had to look away from because it was too direct and too open for a man she had known for 2 days. They spent the afternoon going through the property together. She showed him every change, every repair, every improvement and its documentation. He walked through the limestone house room by room in a silence that was not uncomfortable, touching things lightly: the bookshelf, the scarred wooden table, the iron hook beside the door where a coat had presumably once hung. She stood in the doorway of the main room while he did this, and looked at the good solid walls and the clean plank floor, and felt the strange doubling of knowing this place intimately from the outside, through documents and occasional inspections, and having it suddenly inhabited by the person it actually belonged to. He found something on the windowsill that she had not noticed in her inspections, a small smooth stone, dark with a single white streak running through it. He picked it up and held it in his palm, and she could see by his expression that it meant something specific to him. "My wife put that there," he said, and then glanced at her with a look that preempted misunderstanding. "She died in '77 before I drove the cattle south." "I didn't know you had been married," she said. "It was short," he said. "She was ill when we came here. I built the house thinking the air might help." He was quiet for a moment. "It didn't." "I'm sorry," Mamie said. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. They stood in the quiet of the limestone house with their respective griefs, and the winter light coming through the windows, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And it was the most comfortable silence Mamie Fletcher had experienced in 5 years. They rode back toward Caldwell in the afternoon light, the sun already dropping toward the western bluffs and coloring the prairie amber and rose. The horses walked at an easy pace. They talked more on the return ride than they had on the outward journey, and the conversation moved in that way that good conversation moves when two people are genuinely interested in each other's minds, from the practical to the specific to the personal, following each thread naturally without forcing it. He asked her how she had come to do land record work. She told him about Thomas, about the months after his death when she had needed to keep herself occupied and solvent, about Sela's Denny offering her work copying records because her penmanship was the best he had seen. She told him how she had quickly discovered that she not only had good penmanship, but a genuine aptitude for understanding the logic of property law, and how that aptitude had grown into a practice over 3 years. He asked if she had found it difficult, a woman doing that kind of work in Caldwell. She said, "At first. Some men came to the office expecting Sela's and found me instead and decided their business could wait. Some of them came back. Some of them found someone else, which was generally their loss." He said, "Prescott Hale," she said. "Prescott Hale in particular," he said. "Tell me about Hale." She told him. Hale was a large-scale rancher who had been expanding his operation steadily for a decade, generally by identifying weak or uncertain land titles and applying legal pressure until the owners either sold cheap or gave up. He had not quite crossed into outright illegal territory, but he had come close, and he had a Wichita lawyer who was skilled at finding the technical cracks in documentation. He had tried to absorb 3 other properties besides Hudson's in the last 5 years. He had succeeded with 2 of them. "He'll try again," she said. "He knows you're back. Word travels fast in Caldwell." What would he try? He might challenge the continuous ownership claim, arguing that 4 years of absence constitutes abandonment regardless of the estate management. It's not a strong argument under current Kansas law, but he might try it, or he might approach you directly and offer to buy. "If he offers to buy, that's your business," she said. "But the land is worth considerably more than whatever he offers." "I'm not selling," Calvin said flatly. There was no deliberation in it. It was simply a fact. "Then make sure your records are up to date and your fences are where your deed says they are," she said. "My records," he said, with a slight emphasis that made her aware of the phrase, "are extremely up to date." They reached Caldwell as the sun was setting and the town was lighting its lamps. The main street glowed warmly against the cold blue dusk, and the smell of wood smoke came from every chimney. Mamie reined Clover in at the land office and dismounted. "Thank you for coming out today," Calvin said, still mounted. "I wouldn't have known half of what I needed to know without you there." "You would have figured it out," she said. "Not as quickly," he said. He sat looking at her for a moment with the lamplight from the land office window falling across his face. "Can I buy you supper, Mrs. Fletcher?" At the hotel, Mamie considered this. The hotel dining room was a respectable establishment. Supper was a respectable meal. There was nothing in the invitation that was not perfectly appropriate. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They ate supper in the hotel dining room, which served a reasonable beef stew and bread that was fresh enough, and they talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say. Mamie, who had spent 4 years knowing Calvin Hudson through the impersonal language of legal documents, found that the actual man was considerably more interesting than even she had imagined. He had opinions about land management that were ahead of most of what she heard from ranchers in Caldwell, careful ideas about rotating grazing, about maintaining the creek corridor, about not overstocking a pasture in a dry year, even if the short-term numbers argued for it. He had read widely, which explained the Don Quixote on the bookshelf, and he talked about books with the same ease that he talked about cattle and fences. She found herself talking more than she usually did in company. She told him about a theory she had regarding Kansas water rights that she thought would become legally relevant within the next decade, as the state grew more populated and the aquifer more contested. She told him about the Delaney brothers' land division and the particular knot of their argument that had taken her 3 days to untangle. He listened to all of it with the same total attention he had given the ledger in the office, and asked questions that proved he had understood. Walking back to her house afterward through the cold, dark street, Mamie Fletcher was honest with herself in a way she had not permitted for 4 years. She was in serious difficulty. This man was exactly what the 4 years of his paperwork had suggested he might be, and the actuality of him was considerably more dangerous than the suggestion. She was also 31 years old, had been alone for 5 years, and had spent the last 4 of them keeping faith with a man she had never met because it was right, and because somewhere in the back of her chest she had perhaps always known this day was coming. She went home and sat by her stove and thought carefully about what she was doing. Calvin Hudson moved back into the limestone house at Hudson Creek Flats the following week, taking 2 pack horses loaded with supplies from Caldwell and the tools he would need to prepare the place properly for winter. He stopped at the land office the morning he left and settled his account with Sela's Denny, and then stood before Mamie's desk and said, "I'll need to come into town regularly through the winter, for supplies, and for administrative matters." "Administrative matters," she said. "The kind that require a land records expert," he said, and there was that slight warmth in his eyes again that she was learning to recognize. "I keep regular hours," she said. "I know," he said. "I asked Pearl Hutchins." Mamie looked at him. He had the particular expression of a man who knows he has said exactly the right amount. He came into town every week through the winter, sometimes twice. He always stopped at the land office, and they always had legitimate matters to discuss because there was genuinely a great deal of work remaining to properly re-establish his land tenure after 4 years of legal uncertainty. She filed a formal reinstatement of active ownership with the county. She updated the water rights registration. She helped him draft a clear letter to Prescott Hale's lawyer, confirming that the property was in full active management and that any future claims of abandonment would be vigorously contested. But they also had supper at the hotel, and they walked along the main street of Caldwell in the cold January evenings after the office closed. And they talked about everything about Kansas and New Mexico and what the territory out west looked like, about books, about the changes coming to the cattle trade with the expansion of the railroads, about the homesteaders arriving each year on land that had been open range, about what that meant for the future of ranching. He never said anything that overstepped. He was careful and decent, and she noticed the carefulness and found it, perversely, more attractive than boldness would have been. A man who is careful with boundaries is a man who understands that they exist for a reason. In February, Prescott Hale made his move. He came into the land office on a Tuesday morning with his Wichita lawyer, a sleek man named Aldridge who wore a suit that cost more than most Caldwell residents made in a month. They sat down across from Mamie's desk, and Aldridge presented a carefully assembled argument that Calvin Hudson's 4-year absence, during which the property had been technically managed by a county agent rather than the owner himself, constituted a de facto change in possession status that created grounds for a new ownership assessment. It was a creative argument. It had no merit whatsoever under Kansas law, but it was creative. Mamie listened to all of it with her hands folded and her expression patient. When Aldridge finished, she opened her desk drawer and produced a copy of the 1875 Kansas Land Tenure Act, the 1879 Kansas Property Management Statutes, and 3 previous court decisions from the Kansas District Courts addressing similar arguments, all of which had been decided against the claimant, and all of which she had had the foresight to copy and file 18 months ago, when she had first anticipated that Hale might try something like this. She went through each document methodically. She was not unkind. She was simply thorough. Hale watched her with an expression that shifted gradually from confidence to irritation to a grudging awareness that he had miscalculated. Aldridge, to his credit, recognized the quality of the legal argument being made against him and stopped interrupting after the first document. When she finished, she said, "Mr. Hale, Calvin Hudson has owned this land since 1875, maintained it in accordance with all applicable statutes, and has returned to active residence. No argument of abandonment or adverse possession has any legal foundation. If you file a formal claim, I will oppose it, and based on the precedents I have just cited, the outcome is not in doubt. I would suggest that Mr. Aldridge bill you for this meeting and advise you to find a different avenue for your expansion plans." Hale looked at her for a long moment. He was a large man, red-faced, with the kind of certainty in his eyes that money and uncontested authority had built over many years. The certainty was having a difficult morning. "Who are you to be telling me this?" he said. "I am the person who has maintained these records for 4 years and knows them better than anyone in Caldwell, including Sela's Denny," she said pleasantly. "And I am the person who will be representing Mr. Hudson's interests if this goes before a judge. You can decide for yourself what that means for your prospects." Hale left. Aldridge left just behind him, and Mamie thought she saw a trace of approval in the lawyer's expression as he went out, the professional kind, the kind one craftsman shows for another's good work. She told Calvin about it when he came into town 2 days later. He listened with his elbows on her desk and his hat on his knee, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Hale actually came in here himself," he said. "He did. That was a mistake on his part." "It was," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. The February light was pale and even through the land office windows, and outside the street was quiet. Most of Caldwell settled in against the cold. "Mamie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it. "Yes," she said. "I would like to thank you properly," he said. "Not the way I thanked you in November. That was for the records, for the 4 years. I want to thank you for today, which you didn't have to do. You're not being paid to fight hail on my behalf." "It falls under the general scope of land records management," she said. "It does not," he said. She looked at her desk. "No," she said. "It doesn't, so let me thank you. You bought me supper in November," she said. "Mamie," his voice was quiet and very direct. "I'm not talking about supper." The silence that followed was warm and serious and very aware of itself. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, and there was nothing ambiguous in his expression now. 4 years of absence and return and careful weekly visits and very good conversation had arrived at this moment, and they both understood it. "Calvin," she said. "Yes. I kept your land records because it was the right thing to do," she said, "and because I take my work seriously. That's still true." "I know that," he said, "but," she said. "But," he agreed. "I don't quite know what to do with the other part," she said honestly. "The other part." "I know your land better than you do," she said. "I know your deed and your water rights and your fence lines and your barn repair. I know the tree line along your creek and the way your south pasture holds water after rain. I've ridden your land in every season." She paused. "And I've been alone for 5 years, and I am not," she stopped. "Not what?" he said gently. "Not as indifferent as I have been pretending to be since November," she said, and the honesty of it sat in the room between them like something that had needed to be set down. Calvin Hudson looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk, slowly and carefully, and covered her hands with one of his. It was a large, warm, work-hardened hand, and the gesture was simple and completely certain. "I came back to an empty house," he said. "I thought I was coming back to a piece of land. I came back and found 4 years of someone caring for something I had left behind, and it turned out the person who did that was," he paused, "was someone I find I can't stop thinking about." "That is inconvenient," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Very inconvenient," he agreed, and there was a warmth in his voice that undid the last of her careful composure. "But I think we're both old enough to manage inconvenient things." She turned her hand under his and held it. "I am 31 years old," she said. "I do not generally make decisions quickly." "I'm 33, he said. "I have been making fast decisions in dangerous places for 4 years, and every one of them kept me alive long enough to come home. I don't plan to be hasty," he paused, "but I also don't plan to be a fool." "What does that mean specifically?" she asked. "It means I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." Mamie Fletcher, who had kept her own counsel in all matters for 5 years and who had a well-deserved reputation for calm professional judgment, squeezed his hand once and said, "I'm willing." Spring came to Caldwell in the long, slow way of the Kansas spring, the snow retreating gradually before a series of warm southern winds, the prairie going from tawny to green, in a progression so gradual you had to look away for a week, and then look back to see it had happened. The creek at Hudson Creek Flats ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods budded out in that particular pale gold that lasted only about 10 days before it became green. Calvin came into town twice a week now, and Mamie rode out to Hudson Creek Flats twice a month, which was more than her professional duties required, and they both understood it. He was rebuilding the operation with the careful attention of a man who has thought for 4 years about what he would do differently if he got the chance. He bought a small remuda of good horses and 6 dozen cattle to start, choosing quality over quantity with the intention of building slowly. He repaired every fence line personally, finding the work meditative rather than tedious. He also restocked the bookshelf. She noticed this on her 3rd visit in March and looked at the new titles without comment. A volume of poetry by Alfred Tennyson, a history of the cattle trade, a natural history of North American birds, and a medical text on frontier health that she thought showed a kind of practical foresight. She brought him a book in April, a survey of Kansas land law published in 1881 that she had a second copy of and thought he should read. She had annotated it in the margins, her small, precise handwriting noting every section that was relevant to his specific holdings. He read it within the week and came back with questions that went on for 3 hours and led, entirely naturally, to the subject of what they both thought the future of Kansas ranching looked like in a decade when the railheads were more established and the homestead claims had fully changed the character of the open range. "The small ranches are going to have to be smarter than the large ones," he said. "Better managed, better documented, better understood by the people running them." "You sound like you have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "New Mexico gave me a great deal of time to think," he said. "And most of what I thought about eventually came back to what I'd do differently when I got home." "And what did you think you'd do differently?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the view through the limestone house's front window, the creek and the cottonwoods in the south pasture. "I thought I'd pay more attention," he said, "to what I had, to the people worth having in my life." He looked at her. "I'd been alone for a year when I drove south, after my wife. I think I was using the cattle drive partly to avoid sitting still and thinking about what I was avoiding. And now," she said, "now I want to sit still," he said. "I want to look at this land and know it properly and have it matter to me the way it should have always mattered." He paused. "And I want the right company for that." In May, Prescott Hale made one final attempt. He sent 2 of his hands to move a section of fence on the northern boundary while Calvin was in town, rolling the wire back 40 feet into Calvin's property in a section that was difficult to see from the main road. It was the oldest trick in the cattleman's book, and it might have worked if Mamie had not already established the habit of documenting every boundary marker with surveyed coordinates. Calvin discovered it the same day when he rode his northern fence line on the way back from town. He came to the land office the next morning with the exact measurements of the discrepancy written on a piece of paper in his own careful hand. Mamie filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff and a civil trespass claim with the county court within 2 hours. The evidence was unambiguous. The original survey coordinates, on file with the county in documents she had maintained, matched Calvin's measurements precisely. Hale's fence had been moved 42 feet into Hudson property. Sheriff Tom Reardon rode out to Hale's ranch personally, which was not something Tom Reardon enjoyed doing because Hale was a substantial taxpayer and a man who remembered when people crossed him. But the evidence was too clean and too well documented to ignore. Hale paid a fine and had the fence moved back. He never troubled the Hudson property again. The morning after the fence matter was resolved, Calvin arrived at the land office before Mamie had finished opening the shutters. He came in with his hat in his hand and a look of deliberate intention on his face that she recognized as distinct from his usual expression. "I want to ask you something," he said. Mamie set down the shutter hook. "All right," she said. "I know we said we would not be hasty," he said, "and I have not been hasty. I have been coming to town twice a week for 6 months and thinking about this question very carefully, and I believe I have been patient enough that it does not qualify as hasty anymore." "What is the question, Calvin?" she said. "I want you to marry me," he said. "I want you to come out to Hudson Creek Flats and live there with me and bring all your books and your ledgers and your surveying maps and whatever else you need. And I want to spend the rest of my life in reasonable proximity to the most capable and interesting person I have ever met." The morning light came through the land office windows and fell across the desk with its familiar stacks of documents. The room smelled of ink and paper and the faint cedar scent that came from the wainscoting. Outside, Caldwell was waking up in its ordinary way, horses and boots and the smell of somebody's bread baking. Mamie Fletcher looked at Calvin Hudson and felt everything she had been carefully managing for 6 months reorganize itself into something simple and clear. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands in both of his, and they stood like that in the middle of the land office with all the documented geography of their unlikely story around them. And he kissed her once carefully, with the same quality of attention he brought to every important thing. "Good," he said. "You should know," she said when she had her composure back, "that I intend to keep working. Land record work. I won't be only a ranch wife." "I know that," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "I would never ask you to be only anything. And I intend to keep fighting Prescott Hale if he ever steps out of line again," she said. "I would actually prefer it," he said. They were married in June of 1884 in the Caldwell Church, a modest ceremony attended by Silas Denny, who wiped his eyes twice and pretended not to, Pearl Hutchins, who wiped her eyes once and did not pretend, the mason Ike Bauer, the surveyor Henry Gall, both Delaney brothers who had managed not to kill each other long enough to attend, Clara Potts the widow who had filed the homestead claim, and Sheriff Tom Reardon, who shook Calvin's hand and told him he was a lucky man, and told Mamie she was the reason half the land claims in Caldwell County were in order. After the ceremony, they rode out to Hudson Creek Flats together, and Mamie brought her books and her ledgers and her annotated Kansas land law volume, and a good cast iron pan that had been Thomas's, and that she had always been too sensible to part with. She brought Clover, who settled happily into the stone barn alongside Calvin's bay gelding, and immediately established which horse was senior. She also brought her surveying tools, which she set up in a small room off the main hall that Calvin had cleared out for her use, fitting it with a writing table and a proper chair, and a lamp with a good steady wick. He called it her office. She called it her office. That was that. The first summer at Hudson Creek Flats was a revelation in ways that Mamie had not anticipated. She had known the land professionally, and had thought that knowing it as a place to live would simply be a different application of the same knowledge. She had not accounted for the way it felt to be in a landscape rather than to document it. She had not accounted for the sound of the creek at night through the open window, constant and cool and utterly particular to this valley. She had not accounted for the way the light changed on the limestone bluffs through the day, gray in the morning and golden in the afternoon, and rose at sunset in a way that stopped being beautiful and became something else, something more like a fact that required no commentary. She had not accounted for the pleasure of a shared morning, coffee made in the limestone kitchen, while the sun came over the eastern bluffs, and the horses moved in the barn, and the day organized itself around the simple fact of work and company. She had not accounted for Calvin Hudson specifically, the way he was in ordinary life, unhurried, careful, attentive in exactly the way he had described wanting to be when they had talked in April. He noticed things. He noticed when the fence line along the south pasture had a section that had shifted slightly under winter ground movement and had it fixed before it became a problem. He noticed when the creek had a new beaver activity upstream and thought carefully about what that meant for the water level at the house. And he noticed her, not in an intrusive way, but in the way of a man who finds a person genuinely interesting and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He noticed when she was absorbed in a problem and gave her the silence she needed. He noticed when she came out of her office with the particular look she got when she had solved something difficult, and met it with a simple satisfaction that matched her own. In the fall of 1884, Prescott Hale sold his ranch operation and moved to Wichita, where he apparently intended to pursue his expansion instincts in a more urban context. Mamie heard about it from Pearl Hutchins, who reported it with considerable satisfaction. Caldwell breathed a collective sigh that was felt, if not formally acknowledged. Mamie sat at her desk in her small office at Hudson Creek Flats and wrote up the final note on the Hale matter in the Hudson land file, which she maintained with the same precision she had always maintained it. She noted the cessation of Hale's threat, the current legal status of all boundaries, the outcome of the trespass filing. She filed it under resolved and closed the folder. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the late afternoon light on the limestone walls of her office, and felt a deep, unhurried satisfaction that was different from professional satisfaction, but not entirely separate from it either. Calvin appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the natural ease of a man in his own home, which was also now her home, which she was still occasionally surprised to be. He set a cup on her desk and looked at what she was working on. "Hail file," he said. "Filed under resolved," she said. He nodded. He sat down in the extra chair she had put in the office for exactly these moments when he wanted to come in and think alongside her. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "What?" "The cattle," he said. "Not specifically the cattle, the operation. I think I want to expand slowly, deliberately. Not the way Hale expanded, not taking other land. Just building what I have, improving the pasture management, adding a breeding program." He looked at her. "I'd want your opinion on the financial side of it." "The financial side of a breeding program for Hudson Creek Flats," she said, "if you're willing to look at the numbers." "Calvin," she said, "I have been managing your numbers for 5 years. I think I can manage them for the foreseeable future." He smiled at that. It was the full smile, the one Pearl Hutchins had been right about, the one that arrived rarely, but when it did, changed the whole character of his face from serious to something warmer and more open. She still was not entirely accustomed to it. "There's something else," he said. "What?" He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the particular quality of the quiet as the kind that precedes something important. "I want children," he said. "I wanted to say it plainly because I think you deserve plainness. I wanted children when I was married before and we didn't have the time. I'm 34 now. I don't want to wait too long." Mamie held her coffee cup and looked at this man she had married and felt something very steady and very certain in her chest. "I want children too," she said. "I have wanted them for years. I simply didn't have the circumstances to make it possible." She paused. "I'm 32. We have time." "Yes," he said. "We have time." She was with child by the following spring. She kept working through the pregnancy because it did not occur to her to do otherwise, and because the land record work of Caldwell County did not pause for personal matters. If anything, there was more work than ever, as the continuing arrival of homesteaders on the former open range created a steady flow of new filings, new disputes, and new needs for careful documentation. She hired a young woman named Agnes Porter as an assistant, training her in the basics of land record management with the same thoroughness she brought to all her work. Calvin neither fussed over her nor ignored her, which was the exact right balance. He made adjustments to the physical work of the ranch without making a production of it. He stocked the kitchen better. He checked in at her office in the evenings with the coffee routine that had become the best part of her day. He asked about her work and listened to the answers. And when she wanted to talk about the baby, they talked about the baby. And when she wanted to talk about the Delaney brothers' ongoing property matters, they talked about the Delaney brothers. In November of 1885, their son was born in the limestone house at Hudson Creek Flats, delivered by the Caldwell doctor, a practical and capable woman named Dr. Ruth Hensley, who had been practicing in the county for 3 years, and who Mamie had great professional respect for. The labor was hard and long, and Mamie held Calvin's hand through the worst of it with considerable force, and he did not mention this afterward. The baby was healthy and large, dark-haired like his father, with Mamie's exact expression of alert, focused attention. They named him Thomas James Hudson, Thomas for Mamie's first husband, in the simple recognition that the past was part of the present and did not need to be erased, and James for Calvin's father, whom he had described once as a man who built things carefully and made them last. Silas Denny came out to Hudson Creek Flats to meet the baby, driven in a wagon by his nephew because his eyesight no longer permitted riding. He held Thomas for approximately 3 minutes, declared him to be a very fine specimen, ate 2 pieces of Mamie's dried apple cake, and went home looking satisfied with the state of the world. Pearl Hutchins brought a quilt she had made, of blue and white, and stayed for an entire afternoon, filling in all the news of Caldwell with the thoroughness that Mamie had always secretly depended on, even while pretending mild exasperation. Mamie sat in the rocking chair that Calvin had made over the winter and nursed the baby, and listened to Pearl, and felt the contentment of this life as a solid, real, physical thing. The following years moved with the particular rhythm that working land establishes: seasons of preparation and seasons of harvest, dry summers and wet ones, years when the cattle brought good prices and years when the market was tight. Calvin's breeding program for the Hudson Creek Flats cattle became something genuinely distinguished in the county, a small herd of excellent quality animals that commanded prices a larger operation of lesser quality could not match. He had been right about the future of small ranching. It required intelligence more than scale. Mamie's land record practice grew steadily as she adapted to handling more of it by correspondence. A network of rural clients who sent their documents and queries to Hudson Creek Flats and received her careful, detailed responses in return. Agnes Porter proved to be as capable as Mamie had hoped and eventually took over the day-to-day office work in Caldwell, freeing Mamie to specialize in the more complex cases. When Silas Denny retired formally in 1887, the county commissioners asked Mamie to take on the title of County Land Records Advisor, which was a new position they created specifically because they had been relying on her expertise for years and decided it was time to make it official. She accepted the position with the condition that she could continue to work primarily from Hudson Creek Flats. The commissioners agreed. It was, after all, the sensible arrangement. In 1887, their daughter came. They named her Ruth, after Dr. Hensley, who had delivered both children and who had become a genuine friend to Mamie in the years since Thomas's birth. Ruth Hudson arrived in the same limestone house on a warm September evening, in considerably less time than her brother had required, and announced herself to the world with an opinion and a volume that left no doubt about her character. Thomas, who was 2.5, looked at his new sister with the careful attention of a person encountering a complex new problem, and then looked at his father and said, "She is very loud." "She is," Calvin agreed. "Is she going to be here for a long time?" "Yes," Calvin said, "the rest of your life." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 2-year-old encountering a permanent fact, and then apparently decided it was acceptable, because he went back to his wooden horse. The years at Hudson Creek Flats were not without difficulty. In 1888, a prolonged drought made the summer brutal, the creek running lower than Mamie had ever seen it, the south pasture browning earlier than it should have. Calvin made the decision early in the season to reduce the herd by 1/3, selling cattle before prices dropped further, absorbing the financial blow in order to preserve the pasture's long-term health. It was a hard decision, and they talked it through at the kitchen table over several evenings, Mamie with her account books and Calvin with his pasture maps, and they arrived at the decision together in the way of two people who have learned to think as a unit without losing the particularity of each other's thinking. The drought broke in September with 2 weeks of steady rain, which was almost too much too fast, but the land took it, and by October the pasture was green again. The herd they had kept was strong. The following year's cattle were among the best Calvin had produced. In the winter of 1888, they had a visitor who changed things in a small but permanent way. His name was Jim Lassiter, and he was a cowboy of about 20 years, half Comanche and half Irish, who showed up at Hudson Creek Flats on a horse that was barely keeping its feet and asked if he could sleep in the barn in exchange for work. He was quiet and competent and had clearly been through a difficult winter. Calvin hired him for 3 days and then 3 weeks and then permanently, because the man had a particular talent for horses that was immediately evident, and because Hudson Creek Flats had grown to a size that genuinely needed another pair of capable hands. Jim Lassiter had a story, which he told in pieces over many months, not from secrecy but from a natural economy of speech. He had grown up on his Comanche mother's people's land in the Texas Panhandle, which had been steadily reduced and redistributed by government order throughout his childhood. He had drifted into ranch work after the last of the land transfers had made the life he had known impossible to continue. He had worked 5 ranches in 6 years, each one adequate and none of them home. Mamie and Calvin both recognized in him the particular quality of a person who has experienced the kind of injustice that sits below the surface of American expansion. The redistribution of lands through treaties that were signed and then ignored. The displacement of people who had lived on and known a landscape for generations, and who then watched it become someone else's legal property through the mechanisms of a law they had never been asked to consent to. They did not pretend the subject was uncomplicated, or that their own land ownership was untouched by that history. They talked about it honestly, Calvin and Mamie, in those evening conversations that were as much a part of their marriage as the shared work and the shared bed. What they could do was what they did. They paid Jim Lassiter a fair wage, treated him as the skilled working partner he was, and made clear in every practical way that Hudson Creek Flats was a place where a man would be judged by his character and his work and nothing else. Jim stayed. He turned out to be a person of considerable quality in all the ways that mattered, and the Hudson children adored him with the unambiguous devotion that children reserve for people who are genuinely interesting and who take them seriously. He taught Thomas to ride before the boy was 5 years old with a patience and skill that left Mamie with something in her chest that was close to gratitude. By 1890, Hudson Creek Flats was everything Calvin had imagined when he built the limestone house 15 years before, and everything more than he had known to imagine then. The cattle operation was sound and well regarded. The land was in excellent condition, properly grazed and carefully maintained, its water rights firmly established in the county records, its boundaries marked and documented and not in dispute. The house had been extended once, a new room added to the east end for the children, and the covered passage between house and barn had been glassed in partially so that Mamie could use it as a working space in cold weather without losing the light. Mamie's office had grown with her practice. There were 2 proper filing cabinets now, a better lamp, a large work table where she could spread maps. Agnes Porter had trained a second assistant in Caldwell, and the practice handled a caseload that would have seemed impossible in 1879. She had argued 2 cases before the Kansas District Court, once in person, which had been a considerable occasion in 1889 since women did not typically argue before Kansas courts, and she had won both. On the evening of what would have been Thomas Fletcher's birthday in October of 1890, Mamie sat in her office at Hudson Creek Flats with the lamp burning and the night coming down outside, and felt the quiet strangeness of a life that had arrived at fullness through such an unlikely route. She thought about the widow she had been in 1879, ink-stained and practical and alone, taking on a dead man's land records for the principle of the thing. She thought about the telegram in 1883 and the weight of it against her chest in the doorway of the land office. She thought about the man who had walked in out of the cold November day and asked who she was, and she thought about what she had said. Nobody important. It still made her smile, the sheer stubborn understatement of it, the refusal to claim anything, the instinct toward deflection that she had been carrying like a habit since Thomas died. She had meant it when she said it, and then she had spent the next 7 years discovering how wrong she had been, not in the diminishing way, not as self-correction, but in the expansive way discovering that the word nobody had never quite fit, had always been a provisional description waiting to be replaced. The door of her office opened and Calvin came in with the coffee, as he did every evening, and set a cup on her desk and settled into his chair. He looked at her expression and said, "What are you thinking about?" "The day you came back," she said. He said, "You asked who I was and I said nobody important." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "I remember." "I was wrong about that," she said. "You were. he said, simply and without elaboration, which was exactly right. They sat with their coffee in the lamplight while the night settled fully over Hudson Creek Flats, and the creek moved over its limestone bed in the dark outside, and the children were asleep in their room, and the horses shifted quietly in the barn, and the whole solid world of this life was arranged around them like a carefully documented property. Every boundary known, every right recorded, every claim properly filed. In the spring of 1891, when Ruth was 3 and Thomas was 5, and Hudson Creek Flats was running 32 head of excellent cattle with Jim Lassiter managing the horse operation with a new young assistant of his own, Mamie discovered she was with child again. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Calvin, not from uncertainty, but from the private pleasure of knowing something wonderful before it became shared. Then she told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in March, while Thomas was eating his oatmeal with the focused attention he brought to food, and Ruth was arranging pieces of corn bread on the table in a pattern that appeared to have significance to her alone. Calvin put down his coffee. He looked at her with an expression that was composed of several things at once: the particular joy of a man who has learned to recognize happiness when it arrives, and something quieter underneath it, gratitude perhaps, the kind that goes deeper than the occasion for it. He reached across the table and took her hand. Ruth looked up from her corn-bread architecture and said, "What?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Calvin said. "Something," Ruth said, with the accuracy of a 3-year-old who has learned to read the room. "Good news," Mamie told her. Ruth considered this and went back to her corn-bread arrangement. Thomas, who had been listening, said, "Is it a baby?" "Why would you ask that?" Calvin said. "Agnes Porter told Pearl Hutchins's daughter that she thought Mama was with child again, and Pearl Hutchins's daughter told me at church," Thomas said, with the guileless directness of a 5-year-old reporting factual information. Mamie looked at Calvin. Calvin pressed his lips together against a smile. "News travels fast in Caldwell," he said. "It always has," Mamie said. The third child arrived in October of 1891 on a clear, cool morning, when the cottonwoods along the creek were at their peak color, gold and amber against the limestone bluffs, the sky above them the deep blue of a Kansas fall. Dr. Hensley delivered him with her usual capable ease. He was smaller than Thomas had been, but healthy and loud, and he had Mamie's coloring and Calvin's expression of alert, specific attention. They named him Samuel Fletcher Hudson, the middle name a bridge between what Mamie had been before and what she had become, a quiet insistence that a life could hold more than one version of itself without contradiction. Sila's Denny held the baby at the christening and declared him the finest specimen yet, which he had also said about Thomas and Ruth, so the comment had acquired a ritual quality. Pearl Hutchins brought another quilt, green and white this time, which she had apparently been making since spring on the reasonable assumption that there would be a need for it. Jim Lassiter stood at the back of the church looking clean and slightly uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, and nodded at the baby with the serious approval of a man being introduced to someone important. Agnes Porter, who had driven out from Caldwell for the occasion, sat next to Mamie after the ceremony and said, "You look very well." "I am very well," Mamie said. "I wanted to ask you something," Agnes said. She was 24 now, sharp and capable, and there was a quality of intention in her manner. "There's a new land dispute case that came in this week. The Harmon family against the county over a homestead reversion claim. It's complicated." "How complicated?" Mamie said. "Complicated enough that I thought you'd want it." Mamie looked at her new son sleeping against her shoulder, at Thomas and Ruth chasing each other among the pews with Calvin pretending not to notice, at the limestone church with its plain windows and the fall sunlight coming through them. "Send me the documents," she said. "I'll look at them this week," Agnes smiled. "I thought you would." The Harmon case took 4 months and was, as Agnes had correctly assessed, extremely complicated. It involved a homestead claim that had been conditionally approved in 1882, a subsequent abandonment and reoccupation by the original claimant's daughter, after the original claimant's death. A county interpretation of the homestead law that Mamie believed was incorrect, and two competing interests from neighboring landowners who had been told the land would revert to county management and had made plans accordingly. She resolved it in favor of the Harmon daughter, a young woman named Eliza Harmon, who was 22 years old and had come back from teaching school in Topeka specifically to work the claim her father had filed. The legal argument required a sustained engagement with the 1862 Homestead Act and its subsequent amendments that Mamie found genuinely absorbing, and the resulting brief was one of the best pieces of legal work she had ever produced. The county commissioner who received the brief, a new man named Patterson who had been skeptical of Mamie's role as county land records advisor, read it twice and then sent her a letter that said, among other things, that he had spoken to 3 Kansas lawyers about her argument, and all 3 of them had confirmed that she was right. He did not quite apologize for having been skeptical, but the tone of the letter was different from the tone of his earlier correspondence. "He came around," Calvin observed when she showed him the letter. "They usually do," she said, "when the documentation is sound." "Is that a metaphor?" he said. "I never rely on metaphor when fact will serve," she said. He took the letter from her and set it on her desk and kissed her in the manner of a man who has been doing so for 7 years and finds it no less satisfying for the familiarity. In 1893, the children were 7, 5, and 1, and Hudson Creek Flats was full of the particular noise and motion of a household that has achieved a genuine, working abundance. Thomas was already helping with light fence work and had developed a serious interest in the cattle breeding program, sitting beside his father at the kitchen table with the herd records spread between them and asking questions that made Calvin look up and catch Mamie's eye with an expression of quiet pride. Ruth had decided she wanted to be a doctor like Dr. Hensley, which Dr. Hensley had declared an excellent ambition, and she spent her afternoons conducting medical examinations on her dolls, her brother Thomas, and on several occasions Jim Lassiter's horses. Samuel, who was just finding his feet, conducted himself in the general manner of a person who has arrived in a world he finds entirely satisfactory and intends to explore it fully. Jim Lassiter had, over the years, become as much a part of Hudson Creek Flats as the limestone walls themselves. He had his own small house, built on the property's western edge, a single-room stone structure that Calvin and Thomas and Ike Bauer had put up in 1892, when it became apparent that the sleeping space in the barn had exceeded its reasonable service as long-term accommodation. Jim had contributed his own labor to it and had, over the course of a winter, added a small covered porch. He was 30 years old now and more settled than he had been when he arrived, the specific restlessness of a displaced young man having quieted into the steady purposefulness of a person who has found his place. He had begun to correspond with a woman in Caldwell, a half-Kiowa seamstress named Dora Whitehorse, who ran a small shop on the south end of the main street, and who had the same quality of quiet capability that Mamie recognized as the mark of someone who has managed difficult circumstances with intelligence and dignity. Mamie knew her slightly from county business and liked her without reservation. Calvin noticed and said nothing, which was his particular brand of wisdom. Mamie noticed and said nothing to Jim, but did mention to Pearl Hutchins very casually that Dora Whitehorse did excellent work and that Jim Lassiter had mentioned needing a new winter coat. Pearl Hutchins said, "Is that so?" in a tone that indicated she understood perfectly. Jim Lassiter and Dora Whitehorse were married the following spring. It was a small ceremony, as Jim preferred, but it was warm and well attended by the community they had each built in their own way, and Mamie thought it was one of the finest afternoons she had spent in years. By 1895, Mamie had been at Hudson Creek Flats for 11 years. She was 43 years old. She sat in her office on a June evening with the windows open to the warm air and the sound of the creek, with the filing cabinets full of 16 years of accumulated land work, and the shelves holding a practice that had grown beyond anything she had anticipated in 1879. And she understood something she had not understood when she was a young widow taking on a dead man's records for principle and practicality. She understood that the most important work she had ever done was not the Hale injunction or the Dupree fence or the Harmon case or any of the dozens of other cases that had mattered to the people they concerned. The most important work she had ever done was the daily, unhurried, consistent work of a shared life. The keeping of promises that were not written in any document, the maintenance of the kind of trust that is built in ordinary days, the patient attention to another person's reality that constitutes, at its best, the true work of love. She was thinking this when Calvin came in with the coffee, and she looked at him, silver now at his temples, the scar on his jaw a familiar map she had long since learned by heart, and the dark eyes still direct and warm and entirely present. "The cattle come in at good weight this year," he said. "I know," she said. "Agnes sent the comparable market figures from Wichita. Thomas wants to ride with me to the sale in August. He's ready," she said. "He knows those animals." Calvin sat down in his chair and looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was not observation but something more like recognition, the look of a man seeing someone he knows completely and finds continuously interesting. "What were you thinking about before I came in?" he said. She considered how to say it. "About how the work of keeping your land records straight for 4 years turned out to be the beginning of something rather different than a professional arrangement." "It was always more than that," he said, "from the moment I read them." "You couldn't have known that," she said. "You hadn't met me." "I knew your work," he said. "Your work is entirely you, Mamie. Anyone who read those records would know what kind of person kept them." She looked at him across the lamplight and thought about the woman who had said nobody important in November of 1883, with the wind coming off the prairie and 4 years of someone else's documented life in a satchel on her shoulder. "I'm glad you came home," she said. "I'm glad I had something worth coming home to," he said. "And someone." The summer of 1895 passed in the long gold days of Kansas summer, the cattle fat on good grass, the creek running clear, the children growing with the unconscious speed of children who do not yet know they are growing. In the evenings, Calvin and Mamie sat on the front step of the limestone house and watched the light go down behind the western bluffs, the sky going through its nightly inventory of colors, the cottonwoods darkening against it. Thomas, who was 9 now and thoroughly his father's son in the seriousness of his attention, came and sat between them one evening with a piece of paper on which he had been writing something. "What have you got?" Calvin asked. "I am writing down the boundaries of the ranch," Thomas said. "All of them, so they are recorded." Calvin looked at Mamie. Mamie looked at Calvin. "Show me," she said. He showed her. The boundaries were not quite accurate. He had made a small error on the eastern fence line, conflating the creek boundary with the survey boundary, which were not in this section the same, but the instinct was absolutely right, and the care with which he had done it was evident. She corrected the eastern line, explaining the distinction, and watched him absorb it with the same focused attention his father brought to important information. "Why is it important to write it down?" she asked him. He thought about it. "So people know," he said. "So it's real even when you're not there to say it." Mamie put her hand on his dark hair. "That's exactly right," she said. The night came down around Hudson Creek flats the way it always did, gradually and fully, the stars appearing over the limestone bluffs one by one until the sky was full of them, the creek finding its nighttime voice, the barn settling into dark quiet, the lamp burning in Mamie's office window against the dark. The land was documented, the boundaries clear, the records straight. The house was full and warm. The future was the particular kind of open that is not uncertainty but possibility, the kind that belongs to people who have built something solid enough to stand on. In the kitchen, Ruth was conducting a medical examination of a very patient Samuel. In the small stone house to the west, Jim Lassiter and Dora sat on their porch in the warm dark. Somewhere on the south pasture, Calvin's cattle moved in the grass. Agnes Porter in Caldwell was filing the last documents of the Harmon case into permanent record. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his boundary map, making the eastern line more precise. And Mamie Fletcher Hudson, who had once described herself as nobody important in a cold November doorway, sat in the lamplight of her office at Hudson Creek Flats, with the evening air coming in warm through the window and the whole documented, living geography of her life arranged around her, and understood with the clarity of a woman who has spent her life making records accurate that there was nothing more to correct. Everything was exactly as it should be. Every line was in the right place. Every claim was properly filed and properly held. She picked up her pen and opened a fresh ledger page, because there was always more work to do, always more of the present to record accurately for the future. She wrote the date at the top of the page, June 14, 1895, in her clear, deliberate hand, and then she smiled to herself in the warm quiet and began.